They weren't discontinued politely, they were eradicated after lawsuits, recalls, insurer blacklists, and public rage made them radioactive. Detroit didn't fix these cars, it buried them.
Please support us and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.
The Chevrolet Impala 1960 was designed to be admired, not questioned. It was one of the most stylish cars Chevrolet had ever produced. Low, wide, dramatic, and confident. Long rear fins, sweeping chrome, and a roofline that looked impossibly light gave the Impala a sense of motion even when parked. In showrooms, it represented success. On the road, it represented modern America. But beneath that beauty was a dangerous compromise that defined the era. Style was allowed to dictate structure, and the price for that decision was paid in human lives. By 1960, Chevrolet was locked in a design war. Every year demanded something lower, thinner, sleeker. Roof pillars shrank, glass areas grew. Steering wheels became styling elements instead of safety devices. The Impala embodied this philosophy perfectly. Its roof was supported by thin pillars designed to disappear visually, not to resist forces. Its steering column was a solid steel shaft aimed directly at the driver's chest. Its body looked elegant because it sacrificed the very structures that might have protected the people inside. The Impala's thin pillars were among its most dangerous traits. They created the illusion of openness and luxury, flooding the cabin with light and giving the car its signature airy look. Structurally, however, they were a liability. In rollovers or side impacts, these pillars offered little resistance. They bent, folded, or collapsed entirely, allowing the roof to deform violently. Occupant survival space vanished in seconds. Heads and necks were crushed not by extreme speeds, but by a structure never meant to protect them. This weakness became especially lethal during rollovers and offset impacts. The Impala's low roofline and wide stance gave drivers confidence, but when control was lost, through a sudden swerve, a blown tire, or an evasive maneuver, the car's structure failed catastrophically. The roof did not hold, the pillars did not brace, the elegance of the design became the mechanism of injury. Frontal crashes revealed an even darker truth. The Impala's rigid steering column was a direct product of outdated thinking. Chevrolet engineers believed strength equaled safety. A solid column would never fail, never flex, never break. That belief ignored one crucial fact. In a crash, something must give. In the Impala, it was the driver. When the car struck an object head-on, the frame rails and engine were driven rearward. The steering column followed. At the same time, the driver's body was thrown forward. The steering wheel became a weapon, driven into the chest with the combined force of the car's mass and the driver's momentum. Chest compression injuries were common. Ribs shattered, sternums fractured, internal organs ruptured. Death often occurred instantly, even in crashes that did not appear severe from the outside. The interior offered no refuge. The dashboard was steel, the trim was chrome, padding was minimal and decorative. Seatbelts were optional and frequently unused. Even when worn, early lap belts did nothing to prevent upper body impact with the steering wheel and dashboard. The Impala's cabin was designed to look refined, not to manage human movement during violent deceleration. What made the Impala especially dangerous was how convincingly it hid these flaws. It drove smoothly, it felt stable at speed, it absorbed road imperfections with ease. Drivers believed they were safe because the car felt composed. That composure masked how little margin existed when something went wrong. There was no gradual escalation of danger, just a sudden, brutal transition from control to catastrophe. Accident reports from the era repeatedly described the same pattern. The vehicle showed moderate exterior damage. The occupants suffered fatal injuries. Investigators struggled to reconcile the two. The assumption was that the crash must have been extraordinary. In reality, the design was unforgiving. The Impala did not dissipate energy, it delivered it inward. Side impacts were equally merciless. Thin doors and slender pillars offered almost no intrusion resistance. When struck, the structure collapsed into the passenger compartment, transferring force directly into occupants' bodies. There was no buffer, no absorption, no controlled deformation. The car behaved like a rigid object striking another rigid object with people trapped in between. The tragedy of the 1960 Impala lies in its popularity. This was not a rare or experimental vehicle. It was everywhere. Families trusted it. Teenagers drove it. It became part of daily life. Its design flaws were multiplied by sheer numbers, turning individual engineering compromises into a nationwide safety problem. Chevrolet did not act out of malice. They followed the values of the time. Buyers wanted beauty, lightness, and drama. Safety did not sell. Strength was measured by how well the car held its shape after a crash, not by how well people survived it. The Impala excelled by those standards. The car often looked intact after collisions. The occupants did not. Only later would the industry acknowledge the mistake. Collapsible steering columns, reinforced pillars, roof strength standards, and energy-absorbing interiors would become mandatory. But in 1960, those ideas were still optional, still debated, still sacrificed for style and cost. The Impala represents the final flowering of that dangerous mindset. Today, the 1960 Chevrolet Impala is celebrated as a design icon. Restored examples glide across show fields, admired for their proportions and presence. They look graceful, confident, timeless. What is rarely discussed is how little stood between the driver and death when physics intervened. The Impala teaches a harsh lesson from automotive history. Beauty can be deadly when it replaces structure. Elegance becomes lethal when it ignores the human body. The 1960 Chevrolet Impala was not unsafe because it was poorly built. It was unsafe because it was built to be admired first and survived second.
The Pontiac Bonneville 1960 was designed to make drivers feel powerful, important, and untouchable. It was Pontiac at its most confident, a luxury cruiser built for long distances, high speeds, and effortless motion. Wide, heavy, and beautifully styled, the Bonneville promised smooth authority on America's expanding highways. But hidden beneath its elegance was a fatal imbalance. The car carried enormous luxury mass, yet relied on braking systems that were never engineered to control that weight in moments of panic. When drivers needed the Bonneville to stop now, it often couldn't, and intersections, traffic queues, and roadside obstacles became scenes of irreversible disaster. In 1960, the Bonneville sat near the top of Pontiac's lineup. It was long, low, and packed with comfort. Thick upholstery, extensive sound deadening, heavy trim, and large V8 engines all contributed to its refined character and its staggering curb weight. Pontiac proudly marketed this mass as a virtue. Heavier meant smoother. Heavier meant stronger. Heavier meant safer. The assumption was simple. A big car would protect its occupants by sheer presence alone. What was rarely questioned was whether the car could control itself when something went wrong. The Bonneville's braking system was the weak link that turned confidence into catastrophe. Like most American cars of the era, it relied on drum brakes that were marginal even under ideal conditions. They worked adequately during gentle, predictable deceleration, but emergency stops are not gentle or predictable. Panic braking generates heat rapidly, and the Bonneville's weight overwhelmed its braking hardware almost instantly. Drum brakes faded, pedals grew long, stopping distances stretched alarmingly just when every foot mattered. Panic stops revealed the truth with brutal clarity. A driver would approach an intersection expecting the Bonneville to slow with authority. The pedal went down, the nose dipped, but the car kept coming. Heat robbed the drums of friction. The heavy body surged forward, carrying momentum that the brakes could no longer convert into stopping power. What followed was often unavoidable impact: rear-end collisions, intersection crashes, or vehicles sliding helplessly into cross-traffic. The danger was amplified by how calm the Bonneville felt right up until the moment it failed. The suspension was soft, the ride was plush, and road noise was muted to near silence. Drivers felt insulated from speed. 70 miles per hour felt like 50.
That false sense of control encouraged confidence, even complacency. When something unexpected happened, a car stopping suddenly, a light changing late, a pedestrian stepping out, the driver reacted instinctively, trusting the brakes to deliver. The Bonneville betrayed that trust. Brake fade was not a rare occurrence. It was a predictable outcome of physics. The heavier the car, the more energy the brakes had to absorb. Repeated stops, downhill driving, or a single hard panic stop could push the system beyond its limits. Once fade began, it compounded rapidly. The harder the driver pressed, the worse the braking became. Panic intensified, but control diminished. Intersections were the Bonneville's most common killing ground. These crashes were especially violent because they often occurred at partial speed rather than full stops. The Bonneville entered the collision still carrying significant momentum. Side impacts and angular collisions followed, striking other vehicles at speeds high enough to cause severe injury or death. Occupants of both cars paid the price for a braking system that had no margin for emergency situations. Inside the cabin, safety offered little consolation. Seatbelts were optional and frequently ignored. Even when worn, early belts did little to mitigate the violent deceleration of a heavy car stopping abruptly or failing to stop at all. The dashboard was steel. The steering column was rigid. Occupants were thrown forward into unforgiving surfaces. Chest injuries, head trauma, and internal injuries were common outcomes of crashes that began with a simple failure to slow down in time. What made the Bonneville especially dangerous was its reputation. This was not seen as a risky car. It was seen as a premium one. Owners believed they were buying the best: comfort, power, and security wrapped into one impressive package. That belief was reinforced every time the car floated effortlessly over broken pavement or cruised quietly at highway speed. The idea that such a refined machine could be fundamentally unprepared for emergency braking was unthinkable. Yet, accident patterns told a consistent story. The Bonneville didn't stop when it needed to. Drivers were not reckless. Roads were not unusually dangerous. The flaw was systemic. Luxury mass outpaced braking technology, and Pontiac chose not to rebalance the equation. Power and comfort advanced rapidly. Control lagged behind. The Bonneville was also a victim of its era's priorities. American automakers competed fiercely on style, ride quality, and straight-line performance. Safety innovations were slow, optional, and often resisted. Stronger brakes, better heat dissipation, and redundant systems existed in concept, but they cost money and required change. Pontiac, like much of Detroit, chose to keep selling confidence rather than confronting limitation. The result was a car that excelled at everything except the one moment that mattered most. When drivers had time, space, and predictability, the Bonneville was magnificent. When they had none of those things, it became unstoppable. Looking back, the 1960 Pontiac Bonneville represents a critical failure of balance. Luxury without control is not refinement, it is risk. Power without stopping ability is not progress, it is negligence. The Bonneville didn't need to be driven aggressively to become dangerous. It only needed to encounter reality. Today, the Bonneville is admired as a symbol of American excess and elegance. It looks serene and commanding, frozen in chrome and nostalgia. But behind that image lies a darker truth, written in skid marks that never quite reached the intersection line. The 1960 Pontiac Bonneville teaches a harsh lesson from automotive history. A car that cannot stop when panic strikes is not a luxury cruiser, it is a rolling liability. And when mass, speed, and inadequate brakes collide, disaster is not an accident, it is an inevitability.
The Chevrolet Brookwood 1960 was built to serve the American family dream at full scale. It was long, wide, heavy, and practical. A station wagon designed to carry children, luggage, groceries, furniture, and sometimes half a household in a single trip. It promised space, comfort, and versatility at a time when families were growing and highways were expanding. But behind that promise was a structural flaw so severe that it turned everyday rear-end crashes into some of the most brutal and unforgiving accidents of the era. The Brookwood's long, heavy wagon body was paired with a weak rear structure that offered almost no meaningful protection. When struck from behind, the cargo area collapsed forward, driving steel, glass, and cargo directly into the passenger compartment. In 1960, station wagons were not treated as safety-critical vehicles. They were treated as extensions of sedans: longer roofs, longer floors, bigger cargo spaces. Chevrolet did not rethink structure for the wagon's unique risks. The Brookwood inherited sedan-era engineering assumptions that simply did not apply to a vehicle with such an extended rear overhang. The result was a car that looked substantial, but was dangerously hollow where it mattered most. The Brookwood's rear structure was never designed to manage impact energy. There were no reinforced crumple zones, no sacrificial structures meant to absorb force gradually. The rear floor, tailgate, and side panels were thin and lightly braced. This was done to save weight, cost, and manufacturing complexity. In normal driving, it didn't matter. In a rear-end collision, it mattered instantly and fatally. When another vehicle struck the Brookwood from behind, the long wagon body acted like a lever. The impact energy had nowhere to go except forward. The rear structure folded inward, collapsing the cargo area like an accordion. Floor panels buckled. The tailgate intruded violently. Rear glass shattered forward into the cabin. Anything stored in the cargo area, luggage, tools, groceries, even spare tires, became high-speed projectiles launched directly at the rear passengers. This was not a slow or progressive failure. It happened in a fraction of a second. The space behind the rear seat, which families assumed was a buffer zone, disappeared almost instantly. Children seated in the rear were especially vulnerable. There were no head restraints, no reinforced seatbacks, no barriers to stop cargo from surging forward. The Brookwood turned its own practicality into a weapon. Rear-end crashes were becoming more common by 1960. Traffic density was increasing. Stop-and-go driving was routine. Highways funneled fast-moving cars into sudden slowdowns. The Brookwood, often loaded and heavy, was frequently driven at family cruising speeds that made sudden stops difficult. When faster or heavier vehicles struck it from behind, the Brookwood structure simply surrendered. What made these crashes especially tragic was how deceptively minor they often appeared from the outside. The rear of the wagon might look crushed, but not obliterated. The roof might remain intact. The doors might still open. To casual observers, the damage didn't always look catastrophic. Inside, it was. Occupant space was compromised. Rear seat backs were shoved forward. Passengers were crushed between collapsing structure and the unyielding interior ahead of them. The Brookwood's length amplified the danger. The longer the rear overhang, the greater the leverage in a collision. Instead of absorbing energy, it transmitted it forward. The structure did not deform in a controlled manner. It failed all at once. This sudden collapse produced extreme deceleration forces inside the cabin, throwing occupants forward violently even in crashes that occurred at moderate speeds. Seat belts, when present at all, offered little help. Early belts were often lap-only and rarely worn in rear seats. Even when worn, they could not prevent intrusion from behind. Belts restrain bodies. They do not stop steel floors, tailgates, and cargo from invading passenger space. The Brookwood offered no secondary defense once the rear structure failed. The danger extended beyond rear passengers. Front occupants were also affected. As the rear collapsed forward, the entire body structure shifted. The car's mass surged unpredictably. Secondary impacts occurred inside the cabin as occupants were thrown forward into dashboards, steering wheels, and hard trim. What began as a rear-end collision often ended as a full cabin trauma event. The Brookwood's design reflected a broader misunderstanding of station wagon safety. Automakers assumed wagons were safer simply because they were bigger. More steel meant more protection. In reality, more steel without intelligent structure meant more force delivered to occupants. The Brookwood was not absorbing energy, it was channeling it. Families trusted this car completely. It was marketed as dependable, sensible, and family-friendly. Parents loaded children into the rear seats believing the long cargo area behind them provided extra safety. That belief was tragically wrong. The Brookwood's rear structure offered less protection than many smaller cars simply because it was never engineered to resist intrusion. Crash data from the era consistently showed severe injuries in rear-end wagon accidents, but the industry was slow to respond. There were no standards for rear impact protection, no cargo retention requirements, no reinforced rear seat backs. The Brookwood was allowed to exist exactly as it was until changing laws and rising public awareness forced change years later. The Brookwood was not defective. It performed exactly as designed. That is what makes it so disturbing. Its failures were not flukes. They were predictable outcomes of predictable design choices. Chevrolet built a long, heavy family vehicle without acknowledging the unique dangers that length and weight created. Today, the 1960 Chevrolet Brookwood is remembered as a charming relic of the wagon era. It evokes images of road trips, suburban life, and American optimism. At car shows, it looks friendly, harmless, even wholesome. What is rarely remembered is how brutally unforgiving it could be when struck from behind. The Brookwood stands as a reminder that space without structure is an illusion of safety. A large cargo area is not protection if it collapses into the people it's supposed to serve. Practicality becomes peril when engineering fails to respect physics. The 1960 Chevrolet Brookwood did not endanger families because it was cheap or poorly assembled. It endangered them because it was designed for convenience first and survival second. And in rear-end crashes, that priority order turned a family hauler into a crushing machine that offered no escape once impact occurred. It is one of the clearest examples from the era that size alone does not save lives. Structure does. And when structure is missing, even the most practical car on the road can become the most dangerous place to be.
The Plymouth Belvedere 1960 arrived on American roads at a moment when appearances mattered more than consequences. It was marketed as sensible, modern, and solid, an honest family car wrapped in clean lines and confident proportions. To buyers, it looked sturdy enough, wide enough, and heavy enough to be trusted. But the Belvedere's most dangerous flaw was hidden in plain sight. Its body panels and structural elements were only lightly reinforced, especially along the sides. In side-impact collisions, the car did not defend its occupants. It surrendered, collapsing inward and erasing the passenger compartment with alarming ease. By 1960, side impacts were already known to be among the deadliest types of crashes. Unlike frontal collisions, they offered little space for deceleration. There was no long hood to absorb energy, no engine bay to sacrifice itself before impact reached the cabin. Protection depended entirely on door structure, pillars, and side reinforcement. The Belvedere had almost none of what it needed. Plymouth design philosophy at the time was driven by cost control and weight reduction. Lighter panels were cheaper to stamp and easier to assemble. Reinforcement was minimal, often limited to thin inner door skins and basic framing that offered stiffness for normal driving, but almost no resistance under crash loads. In everyday use, this didn't matter. In a side collision, it mattered instantly. When another vehicle struck the Belvedere broadside at an intersection, during a lane change, or in a crossing collision, the doors and side panels did not absorb energy. They buckled. The thin steel folded inward, collapsing directly into the space occupied by the driver or passengers. There was no meaningful buffer zone. The distance between exterior sheet metal and human bodies was measured in inches, and those inches vanished in a fraction of a second. The collapse was violent and abrupt. Door frames twisted, latches failed, windows shattered inward. The B-pillars, lightly braced and narrow, offered little resistance. Instead of distributing impact forces across the body, the structure concentrated them exactly where people were sitting. Ribs, hips, and internal organs absorbed forces the car refused to manage. What made these crashes especially lethal was how ordinary they were. This wasn't about high-speed racing or reckless driving. Many of the worst Belvedere accidents occurred at intersections at relatively modest speeds. One driver misjudged the light, another failed to see cross traffic. The resulting impact, which might have been survivable in a better reinforced car, became fatal because the Belvedere's side structure simply collapsed. Rear passengers were especially vulnerable. The Belvedere's rear doors and quarter panels were even less reinforced than the front. Children and adults seated in the back often had no protection at all beyond thin sheet metal and interior trim. In a side impact, intrusion could extend well past the seat line, crushing occupants before they had any chance to react. The interior offered no secondary protection. Seat belts were optional and rarely worn, especially in rear seats. Even when worn, early lap belts did nothing to prevent side intrusion. The dashboard, door panels, and seat frames were hard and unforgiving. As the structure collapsed, occupants were crushed between incoming steel and unyielding interior surfaces. The Belvedere's size contributed to a deadly illusion. It looked substantial. It felt planted on the road. Drivers believed they were safe because the car appeared strong. That belief was reinforced every time the doors closed with a reassuring thud, or the car cruised smoothly at speed. But strength of appearance is not strength of structure. The Belvedere's rigidity was superficial. Under impact, it failed exactly where protection was most needed. Accident reports from the era often show a disturbing pattern. Exterior damage appeared moderate. The car might not even look destroyed, yet injuries were severe or fatal. Investigators struggled to reconcile the visual damage with the outcome. The answer lay not in speed, but in design. The Belvedere did not absorb energy. It transferred it inward. Side impacts also caused secondary effects that worsened injuries. As the passenger compartment collapsed, the car's mass shifted unpredictably. Occupants were thrown sideways into intruding panels, then forward into dashboards or steering wheels. What began as a single impact became a cascade of trauma inside the cabin. Plymouth did not ignore safety out of ignorance. They followed industry norms. Reinforced side structures were not yet standard. There were no regulations demanding them. Cost pressures rewarded minimalism, and buyers were more concerned with price, style, and comfort than with invisible structural integrity. The Belvedere was a product of those priorities, not an exception to them. The tragedy is that the Belvedere was everywhere. It was a common family car, trusted and familiar. Its flaws were multiplied by volume. Thousands of identical structures were placed on the road, each carrying the same vulnerability, each waiting for a moment when physics would demand more than thin steel could provide. Drivers rarely blamed the car. They blamed themselves. They blamed other drivers. They blamed fate. The idea that a mainstream sedan could be fundamentally incapable of protecting its occupants in a side impact was difficult to accept. Yet the evidence was written repeatedly in crushed door frames and compressed cabins. Only later would the industry change. Reinforced door beams, stronger pillars, side impact standards, and energy-absorbing structures would become mandatory. Those changes were driven by data and by the quiet toll taken by cars like the Belvedere. Today, the 1960 Plymouth Belvedere is remembered as a clean, attractive example of early 1960s design. It looks honest and straightforward, a snapshot of a simpler automotive age. But simplicity came at a cost. The Belvedere's lightly reinforced body panels turned side impacts into catastrophic events, not because the crashes were extreme, but because the car offered no resistance when resistance was everything. The Belvedere teaches one of the harshest lessons in automotive history. Safety cannot be optional, invisible, or sacrificed without consequence. Steel must be placed with intention. Structure must be designed to fail in controlled ways. When it isn't, the human body becomes the crumple zone. The 1960 Plymouth Belvedere did not set out to harm its occupants, but when struck from the side, it did nothing to save them. And in that failure, it earned its place among the most unforgiving cars of its era, a reminder that looking solid is not the same as being safe.
The Buick Wildcat 1960 was a car born from confidence that outpaced caution. Buick wanted power, prestige, and speed wrapped in a single dramatic package, and the Wildcat delivered exactly that, at least in straight lines. Big block V8 power surged effortlessly, the car lunged forward with authority, and highway speeds arrived almost silently. To the driver, it felt like command. To the chassis underneath, it was overload. The Wildcat paired enormous engine output with suspension tuning and structural assumptions that were never intended to cope with it. And when speed met reality, control often vanished without warning. In 1960, Buick sat in a strange middle ground. It wasn't Chevrolet's everyman brand, and it wasn't Cadillac's untouchable luxury empire. Buick wanted excitement without sacrificing comfort, muscle without losing refinement. The Wildcat was the embodiment of that ambition. It was large, heavy, and powerful, tuned to make effortless speed feel natural and safe. The problem was that safety was assumed, not engineered. The Wildcat's chassis was fundamentally an evolution of earlier, slower designs, soft, compliant, and optimized for smooth cruising, rather than dynamic stability. At moderate speeds, this mismatch wasn't obvious. The Wildcat rode beautifully. The suspension absorbed bumps with grace. Steering effort was light, relaxed, and confidence-inspiring in a superficial way. Drivers felt insulated from the road, and that insulation created trust. But trust is dangerous when it is not supported by physics. As speeds climbed, the gap between what the engine could deliver and what the chassis could manage widened dramatically. High-speed driving exposed the Wildcat's fatal imbalance. The big V8 had no trouble pushing the car well beyond the speeds its suspension geometry and damping could safely control. Body roll increased rapidly in sweeping curves. Weight transfer became exaggerated and delayed. The car leaned heavily, then continued leaning long after the driver had completed steering input. That delay destroyed predictability. Drivers would turn, feel nothing alarming at first, then suddenly feel the car roll and drift far more than expected. Once that motion began, correcting it was difficult. The steering lacked the precision and feedback needed to make fine adjustments at speed. Inputs felt vague, and small corrections often produced either no response or too much response too late. Drivers instinctively added more steering, then had to unwind it quickly as the car finally reacted. This oscillation, under-response followed by over-response, was the beginning of loss of control. The Wildcat's weight made everything worse. This was not a light car, and mass amplifies mistakes. Once momentum built, it resisted correction. In high-speed lane changes or evasive maneuvers, the car's body rolled violently from side to side, overwhelming tire grip and unsettling the suspension. The transition from stable cruising to instability could happen in seconds, leaving drivers with no time to adapt. High-speed curves were particularly dangerous. Entered too fast and too fast arrived sooner than drivers realized, the Wildcat would begin to push wide, then suddenly feel loose as weight shifted unpredictably. Rear-end instability followed, often without clear warning. Drivers expecting gradual feedback instead experienced abrupt breakaway. Recovery required skill most ordinary drivers did not have, especially in a car that provided so little communication. Emergency braking at speed compounded the danger. The heavy front end dove dramatically under braking, compressing the suspension and altering steering geometry just as drivers needed control the most. The rear became light and unstable. Steering response degraded further. The Wildcat did not slow and turn as a unified system. It fought itself, with each component operating beyond the limits it was designed for. What made high-speed loss of control so common was not recklessness, but mismatch. The Wildcat encouraged speed. It made speed feel easy, smooth, and safe. Wind noise was minimal. Road vibration was muted. The car felt planted even as it approached the edge of its abilities. There was no clear warning, no gradual buildup of resistance. One moment, everything felt fine. The next, the car was sliding, leaning, or drifting into a situation that could not be undone. Accidents involving Wildcats shared a grim pattern. Drivers lost control at highway speeds without a clear external cause. No collision initiated the event. No mechanical failure was found. The car simply reached the point where its chassis could no longer manage its own momentum. Once that point was crossed, consequences were violent. Departures from the roadway, impacts with barriers or oncoming traffic, rollovers following overcorrection. The car's mass ensured that when control was lost, consequences were severe. Inside the cabin, protection was minimal. Seatbelts were optional and frequently unused. The steering column was rigid. The dashboard was steel and chrome. When loss of control ended in impact, occupants were thrown forward and sideways into unforgiving surfaces. The Wildcat offered comfort in motion, but little mercy when motion ended abruptly. Buick did not intend to build a dangerous car. They built a car according to values that had not yet caught up with reality. Power was advancing faster than control. Engines grew stronger year after year, but suspension tuning, structural reinforcement, and safety systems lagged behind. The Wildcat exposed that gap more brutally than most, because it sat right at the intersection of luxury and performance, fast enough to get into trouble, soft enough to make trouble inevitable. Drivers trusted the Wildcat because it felt calm. Calmness, however, is not stability. Calmness can be deception when it hides limits instead of communicating them. The Wildcat communicated nothing until it was too late. By the time instability was felt, the car was already committed to a trajectory the driver could not change. Looking back, the 1960 Buick Wildcat represents a critical lesson in automotive history. Power cannot exist without control. Speed cannot be offered without stability. A chassis must be designed for the engine it carries, not inherited from a slower past and asked to cope. When those rules are ignored, loss of control becomes not an anomaly, but an expectation. Today, the Wildcat is admired for its style, its presence, and its effortless straight-line performance. It looks confident, muscular, and refined. But beneath that confidence was a car that asked its chassis to do a job it was never meant to do. And when drivers trusted it at speed, that mismatch turned power into peril. The 1960 Buick Wildcat did not fail because it lacked strength. It failed because its strength was unbalanced. Big block power without corresponding control is not progress. It is danger waiting for speed to expose it.
The Ford Country Sedan 1960 was sold as the ultimate American family solution. It was long enough to carry children, luggage, groceries, tools, and furniture in a single trip. It was heavy enough to feel safe. It was familiar enough to inspire trust, and it was engineered with a fatal contradiction at its core: the mass of a full-size family wagon paired with braking hardware fundamentally designed for lighter passenger cars. Nowhere did this mismatch reveal itself more brutally than on long downhill grades, where brake failures didn't just happen, they terrified the people responsible for keeping fleets and families alive. By 1960, the country sedan had become a staple of suburban America. Schools used them, municipal fleets bought them, businesses relied on them. Families loaded them to the roof and pointed them toward highways and mountain roads without a second thought. The wagon's length and weight were presented as virtues: more steel, more stability, more safety. What Ford did not emphasize was that the braking system had not evolved to match that weight, especially under sustained load and heat. The country sedan was heavy even when empty. Add passengers, cargo, tools, or equipment, and its mass climbed rapidly. Every pound mattered when gravity took control. On downhill grades, brakes are no longer just slowing a vehicle. They are fighting physics continuously. In the country sedan, that fight was unwinnable. Ford equipped the wagon with drum brakes that were adequate for routine stops on flat ground. They were never designed for prolonged heat buildup generated by a fully loaded wagon descending long grades. As the driver applied the brakes repeatedly to control speed, heat built rapidly in the drums. Friction materials overheated. Brake fade began quietly, almost invisibly. Pedal feel softened, stopping distances lengthened, and once fade set in, it accelerated with terrifying speed. Fleet drivers learned this lesson the hard way. Descending hills that required constant braking, the country sedan would gradually lose its ability to slow. Drivers pressed harder. The pedal sank lower. The car kept gaining speed. Panic followed. There was no warning light, no audible alarm, just the growing realization that the brakes were disappearing beneath their foot. This wasn't a rare or extreme scenario. It happened during ordinary use: school transport routes, delivery runs, municipal service calls, family road trips through hilly terrain. The country sedan was used exactly as intended, and that was the problem. The car was asked to do something its braking system simply could not sustain. Once braking performance degraded, the wagon's mass took over. The long body surged downhill, momentum compounding with every second. Steering became lighter as weight shifted forward unpredictably. Attempts to slow the car through engine braking helped little. Drivers were often forced to choose between running off the road, colliding with obstacles, or entering intersections at speeds they could no longer control. Intersection approaches at the bottom of grades were especially dangerous. Drivers expected the wagon to slow as usual. Instead, it rolled forward relentlessly, brakes overheated and ineffective. Rear-end collisions, cross-traffic impacts, and barrier strikes followed. These were not reckless drivers pushing limits, they were ordinary people betrayed by inadequate hardware. The terror was amplified by how normal everything felt before failure. The country sedan rode smoothly. It felt stable and composed. There was no sense of strain as the wagon descended hills. The illusion of control remained until it was gone. That sudden transition from confidence to helplessness left drivers with seconds to react and no good options. Inside the cabin, safety offered little consolation. Seatbelts were optional and often unused, especially in rear seats. Cargo was rarely secured. In downhill brake failure crashes, the sudden deceleration or impact launched passengers and cargo forward violently. The long wagon body became a corridor of motion, turning luggage, tools, and household items into projectiles. What made fleet buyers especially uneasy was the pattern. One failure could be dismissed. Repeated reports could not. Municipalities and businesses noticed the same complaints: poor downhill braking, fading pedal feel, frightening loss of control under load. The country sedan developed a quiet reputation, not for unreliability, but for fear. Drivers dreaded hills. Supervisors worried about liability. Confidence eroded. Ford did not design the country sedan to be unsafe. They designed it according to an outdated assumption that brakes only needed to handle short, intermittent stops, not sustained thermal punishment. That assumption no longer matched reality. Highways extended into mountainous regions. Traffic density increased. Wagons were heavier and more heavily loaded than ever before. The engineering simply lagged behind usage. The country sedan's long wheelbase and mass also worked against recovery once braking performance declined. It could not shed speed quickly. It could not maneuver sharply to avoid danger. Once committed to a downhill path with fading brakes, the wagon became a runaway object obeying gravity more than driver input. Drivers described the experience in stark terms. The car felt like it was pulling them downhill. The brakes felt gone. The pedal felt useless. Panic replaced planning. These weren't dramatic exaggerations. They were accurate descriptions of a system pushed beyond its limits. Today, the 1960 Ford Country Sedan is remembered fondly as a symbol of American family life. It evokes nostalgia, road trips, kids in the back, vacations, utility. What is rarely remembered is how close those moments often came to disaster when terrain and physics intervened. The country sedan stands as a cautionary tale about mismatched engineering. A vehicle's brakes must be designed for its worst-case use, not its best-case scenario. Family wagons are not just passenger cars with longer roofs. They are heavier, more demanding machines that require stronger systems to remain safe. The 1960 Ford Country Sedan failed not because it was poorly built, but because it was underprepared. It carried the mass of a utility vehicle and the stopping power of a sedan. On downhill grades, that imbalance turned fear into inevitability. It teaches a hard lesson from automotive history. When brakes are asked to do more than they were designed for, they don't fail gracefully. They fade quietly, steadily, and then all at once. And when that happens in a heavy family wagon pointed downhill, survival depends not on engineering, but on luck.
The Oldsmobile Starfire, 1960, was built to impress at first contact. It was fast, smooth, confident, and expensive. It carried powerful engines that delivered effortless acceleration, wrapped in a body that looked modern and upscale, and marketed as a premium personal car for drivers who wanted more than basic transportation. From behind the wheel, it felt advanced. From a distance, it looked safe, and that was the most dangerous illusion it offered. Beneath the performance and polish was a safety design rooted firmly in the past, and when frontal crashes occurred, the Starfire revealed just how lethal that contradiction could be. By 1960, Oldsmobile had mastered the art of selling speed without drama. The Starfire's engines produced strong torque and smooth power delivery that made highway speeds feel easy and controlled. Acceleration was quiet and confident, never frantic. Wind noise was muted. Suspension tuning smoothed out imperfections. The car encouraged drivers to cruise faster than they realized, not because they were reckless, but because the machine made speed feel natural and safe. That sense of safety, however, was cosmetic. The engineering beneath it had not evolved to protect human bodies when that speed suddenly had to stop. Frontal crashes exposed the Starfire's most catastrophic flaw: outdated safety architecture paired with modern performance. The car's structure emphasized rigidity, not energy management. The frame resisted deformation instead of absorbing impact progressively. There were no crumple zones designed to sacrifice themselves gradually. When the Starfire struck an object head-on, it did not slow gently. It stopped violently. And when a car stops violently, the human body becomes the weakest component in the system. The rigid steering column was the centerpiece of that failure. Like many American cars of the era, the Starfire used a solid steel column that ran straight from the steering wheel to the steering gear. It was strong, durable, and utterly unforgiving. In a frontal collision, as the engine and frame rails were driven rearward, the steering column followed. At the same time, the driver's body was thrown forward. The steering wheel became a fixed target moving toward the driver at speed. Chest compression injuries were common and severe. Ribs shattered, sternums fractured, internal organs ruptured. Even crashes that did not look especially violent from the outside often proved fatal inside the cabin. Seatbelts, when present at all, did little to mitigate this outcome. Early lap belts restrained the pelvis but allowed the upper body to continue forward unchecked. The driver's torso still met the steering wheel with devastating force. Passengers fared little better. The dashboard was steel, trimmed with chrome and sharp edges. There was no padding capable of absorbing meaningful energy. Faces, knees, and chest struck unyielding surfaces at the exact moment the car's mass finished its abrupt stop. What made these injuries especially tragic was how unexpected they were. The Starfire did not feel like a dangerous car. It felt composed, refined, and stable. Drivers trusted it implicitly. That trust was reinforced by how well the car handled routine driving and high-speed cruising. There were no warning signs, no hints that the car's safety philosophy belonged to a slower era. When a sudden obstacle appeared, a stopped vehicle, a misjudged turn, a moment of distraction, the transition from confidence to catastrophe was instantaneous. The Starfire's power made the consequences worse. Higher cruising speeds meant higher kinetic energy, and that energy had to be dissipated somewhere. In modern cars, it is absorbed by deforming structures. In the Starfire, it was absorbed by people. The car's strength protected the machine. It did not protect its occupants. Survivability depended less on speed and more on luck. Angles, secondary impacts, and whether bodies avoided the steering wheel by inches rather than feet. Crash reports from the era often reveal a disturbing mismatch. The exterior damage appeared manageable. The front end might be bent, the bumper distorted, the hood crumpled. The passenger compartment often looked intact, and yet the injuries were catastrophic. Investigators struggled to reconcile the visible damage with the outcome. The answer lay not in what the car showed, but in what it did not do. It did not manage energy. It did not slow occupants gradually. It delivered force directly and instantly. Passengers seated beside the driver were also vulnerable to secondary impacts. As the car stopped abruptly, occupants collided with each other, with door panels, with the hard dashboard. Without shoulder restraints or airbags, bodies moved freely until something stopped them. The Starfire's interior offered no mercy once motion began. Oldsmobile did not design the Starfire to be unsafe. They designed it according to priorities that had not yet been challenged by regulation or public awareness. Performance sold cars, comfort sold cars, style sold cars. Safety was assumed to be inherent in size and steel. The Starfire embodied that assumption perfectly. It was big, it was heavy, it felt solid. That feeling substituted for real protection. What makes the 1960 Starfire especially significant is its timing. The industry was on the brink of change. Engineers already understood the value of collapsible steering columns, energy-absorbing structures, and interior padding. Those ideas existed, they simply weren't yet mandatory, and they were often dismissed as unnecessary or too expensive. Cars like the Starfire were the final expression of an old belief system, sold into a world that had already outgrown it. Drivers who survived Starfire crashes often describe the experience in stark terms. The car felt like it hit a wall. There was no sense of gradual slowing. The impact was sudden and overwhelming. Injuries happened instantly. Recovery was rare. These accounts were not anomalies. They were the predictable result of pairing modern speed with obsolete safety thinking. Today, the Oldsmobile Starfire is admired for its elegance and performance. It represents a confident moment in American automotive history, when power and comfort defined success. At car shows, it looks dignified and capable, a reminder of when driving felt glamorous. What is rarely discussed is how vulnerable its occupants were when glamour met reality. The Starfire teaches one of the most important lessons of the era. Power without protection is not progress. Speed without survivability is not advancement. A car can feel safe, look safe, and still be deadly when the laws of physics intervene. The 1960 Oldsmobile Starfire did not fail because it lacked engineering. It failed because it trusted the wrong kind of engineering that protected metal instead of people. And in frontal crashes, that trust was paid for with catastrophic injuries that no amount of power, prestige, or polish could prevent. The Dodge Phoenix 1960 was never truly at home on American roads. It was a car born from compromise, shaped by export logic, and then quietly asked to survive in an environment it was never properly engineered for. On paper, the Phoenix looked like a perfectly ordinary full-size Dodge, wide, stylish, powerful, and confident. In reality, it carried suspension tuning and dynamic assumptions intended for overseas markets, where speeds were lower, roads were narrower, and driving demands were fundamentally different. When that export-tuned setup collided with the reality of U.S. highway speeds, the result was instability, unpredictability, and a pattern of control failures that shocked drivers who trusted the Dodge name. By 1960, American highways had changed dramatically. Interstates encouraged sustained high-speed travel, long sweeping curves, and traffic conditions that demanded stability at speeds far beyond what most 1950s designs had ever faced. Cars were expected to cruise comfortably at 70 miles per hour for hours at a time and still respond safely to sudden lane changes, emergency braking, and evasive maneuvers. The Phoenix was not prepared for this world. The Dodge Phoenix had been developed primarily for export markets, such as Australia, where road conditions, speed limits, and driving culture were very different. Suspension tuning favored compliance over control. Spring rates were softer, damping was less aggressive, steering response was tuned for ease rather than precision. On rough or uneven roads at moderate speeds, this setup made sense. It provided comfort and durability. On smooth American highways at sustained high speeds, it became a liability. At speed, the Phoenix felt deceptively calm at first. The ride was soft, almost floating. Small bumps disappeared beneath the suspension. Steering inputs felt light and effortless. Drivers interpreted this as stability. In reality, the car was already operating on borrowed margins. The suspension allowed excessive body movement, and that movement grew more pronounced as speed increased. What felt relaxed at 50 miles per hour became unsettled at 65, and genuinely dangerous beyond that. High-speed cruising exposed the Phoenix's most serious flaw: delayed response followed by exaggerated motion. When drivers made steering corrections at highway speed, the car did not respond immediately. The soft suspension absorbed the initial input, allowing the body to lean before the chassis followed. When it finally reacted, it often did so abruptly. This disconnect between input and response destroyed predictability. Drivers found themselves constantly correcting, never quite in sync with the car's movements. Sweeping highway curves were particularly treacherous. Entered at modern American cruising speeds, the Phoenix leaned heavily, loading the outside suspension far beyond what it was designed to handle. Tires lost grip progressively, but quietly, without clear warning. Steering feedback remained vague. By the time drivers realized how close they were to the limit had already been crossed. The car drifted wide, oscillated, or began to slide in a way that felt sudden and uncontrollable.
Emergency maneuvers made everything worse. A quick lane change, something increasingly common on crowded highways, caused violent weight transfer. The Phoenix rolled heavily in the first direction, then lurched back just as hard when the driver corrected. The suspension could not settle quickly enough. The car felt like it was tipping, floating, or skating rather than tracking cleanly. Loss of control followed, not because of reckless inputs, but because the suspension simply could not stabilize the car fast enough. Braking while maneuvering amplified the instability. As the driver lifted off the throttle or applied the brakes, weight surged forward, compressing the already soft front suspension. Steering geometry changed mid-maneuver. The rear became light and unpredictable. Instead of tightening its line, the Phoenix often pushed wide or snapped into oversteer without warning. Recovery required skill, space, and luck, resources most drivers did not have in real-world traffic. What made these failures especially dangerous was how unfamiliar they were to American drivers. Dodge buyers expected their cars to feel planted and predictable at speed. They trusted the brand to deliver vehicles suited to U.S. conditions. The Phoenix violated that trust. Its behavior felt foreign, almost disconnected from expectations. Drivers described it as wandering, floating, or never quite settled. These weren't subjective complaints. They were accurate descriptions of a car tuned for a different world. Stability failures did not require extreme behavior. Normal highway speeds were enough. Mild steering inputs were enough. Slight curves, crosswinds, or uneven pavement could start a chain reaction the car struggled to stop. Once instability began, the Phoenix offered little feedback to guide recovery. The driver was always reacting to what the car had already done, not what it was about to do. Inside the cabin, safety offered little backup when control was lost. Seat belts were optional and often unused. The interior was hard and unforgiving. The steering column was rigid. When instability ended in impact, occupants were thrown violently into dashboards, steering wheels, and door panels. The Phoenix's failures did not just lead to crashes, they led to severe injuries once crashes occurred. The irony is that the Phoenix was not poorly built. Its components were robust. Its engines were strong. Its construction quality was adequate. The problem was suitability. Engineering decisions that made sense for export markets were never revisited when the car was asked to operate at sustained American highway speeds. The suspension was never retuned properly. Stability margins were never recalculated. The car was simply expected to cope. Drivers paid the price for that assumption. High-speed loss of control incidents became part of the Phoenix's quiet reputation, not scandalous enough to make headlines, but common enough to erode confidence among those who drove them regularly. Fleet buyers noticed. Long-distance drivers noticed. The car did not feel dangerous until suddenly it did. Looking back, the 1960 Dodge Phoenix stands as a cautionary example of what happens when engineering context is ignored. A car is not just an object, it is a system designed for specific conditions. When those conditions change and the system does not, failure is inevitable. The Phoenix teaches a lesson that would later become fundamental to automotive safety and dynamics. Stability must be engineered for the environment the car actually operates in, not the one it was originally designed for. Comfort without control is not refinement. Softness without stability is not safety. Today, the Dodge Phoenix is remembered mostly as an interesting export-era footnote, a rare and unusual Dodge variant. Its real story is more sobering. It was a car that asked American drivers to trust suspension tuning never meant for their roads, at speeds it was never meant to see. And when that trust was tested, on fast highways, in sudden maneuvers, or in moments of panic, the Phoenix revealed the cost of compromise. Stability failed, control vanished, and drivers were left fighting physics with a car that had already surrendered. The Lincoln Capri 1960 was built to project authority, refinement, and absolute confidence. It was not a car meant to feel delicate or responsive. It was meant to feel inevitable. Heavy doors, thick glass, broad pillars, and the massive body created the impression of invulnerability. Sitting inside a Capri felt like sitting inside a fortified structure rolling calmly through traffic. For buyers in 1960, that sensation was the very definition of safety, and it was catastrophically wrong. The Lincoln Capri embodied one of the most dangerous beliefs of mid-century American automotive design, that mass alone could protect human life. Engineers focused on stiffness, durability, and structural rigidity, convinced that a car that refused to deform would somehow shield its occupants. In reality, the Capri's heavy luxury shell did the opposite. By refusing to absorb energy, it delivered that energy directly into the bodies of the people inside. In head-on crashes, survivability was bleak, not because the car failed, but because it succeeded exactly as designed. The Capri was enormous. Its curb weight was substantial even by 1960 standards, loaded with sound insulation, heavy frames, thick body panels, and luxury hardware. Everything about the car emphasized solidity. Lincoln marketing leaned into this image relentlessly. The Capri was quiet, smooth, and dignified. It isolated its occupants from vibration, noise, and harshness. On the highway, it cruised effortlessly, making speed feel calm and controlled. Drivers felt protected, not by technology, but by presence. That feeling of protection masked a fatal flaw. The Capri had no meaningful energy absorption in a frontal collision. There were no crumple zones engineered to progressively deform. The frame rails were stiff and resistant to bending. The front structure was designed to stay intact, not to sacrifice itself. When the Capri struck an obstacle head-on, the car did not slow down gradually. It stopped abruptly. Physics took over, and the occupants continued moving forward at speed until their bodies were stopped by steel. The rigid steering column was the most lethal component in this equation. Like many American cars of the era, the Capri used a solid steel column that connected the steering wheel directly to the steering box. It was strong, durable, and utterly unforgiving. In a head-on crash, as the massive engine and frame shifted rearward, the steering column followed. At the same time, the driver's body was thrown forward by inertia. The steering wheel became a moving target driven directly into the driver's chest. Chest injuries in Capri frontal crashes were often catastrophic. Rib cages collapsed, sternums fractured, internal organs were crushed against the spine. Even when exterior damage appeared moderate, the interior injuries inside the cabin were severe or fatal. The car's mass amplified everything. The heavier the vehicle, the greater the forces involved when it stopped suddenly. Without energy absorption, those forces had only one place to go. Passengers were scarcely better protected. The dashboard was a broad expanse of steel and chrome, with minimal padding that served more decorative than functional purposes. Knees struck metal, faces met rigid trim, bodies collided with each other in the absence of effective restraints. Seat belts, when present at all, were optional and often unused. Even when worn, early lap belts restrained only the lower body, allowing the torso to pivot violently into the dashboard or steering wheel. What made the Capri especially deceptive was how well it performed in everyday driving. It was stable, smooth, and composed. It did not feel dangerous. It did not feel outdated. It felt premium and confident. That confidence encouraged drivers to trust it at speed, to believe it could handle emergencies simply because it felt so substantial. When something unexpected happened, a stopped car, a misjudged turn, a moment of distraction, the Capri's lack of energy management turned ordinary mistakes into fatal events. Head-on crashes were particularly unforgiving because the Capri's design left no margin for survivability. In modern cars, the front end is designed to crumple, extending the duration of the crash and reducing peak forces on occupants. In the Capri, the crash pulse was short and violent. Deceleration happened almost instantly. Human bodies cannot tolerate that kind of abrupt force. Bones fail, organs rupture. Survival depends on luck, not engineering. Accident investigations from the era often revealed a disturbing mismatch. The car looked strong. The passenger compartment appeared largely intact. Doors might still open. The roofline might remain straight. And yet, the occupants were dead or gravely injured. Observers concluded the crash must have been extreme. In truth, the extremity was internal. The Capri structure preserved itself by transferring destruction inward. The irony is that Lincoln engineers believed they were doing the right thing. They equated strength with safety. They believed that a car that stayed intact was protecting its occupants. The human body was treated as a rigid object capable of withstanding enormous forces if surrounded by enough steel. That belief ignored basic biomechanics. The body needs time to decelerate. It needs structures to absorb energy on its behalf. The Capri offered none of that. The car's sheer mass made frontal crashes even more lethal for others on the road. In collisions with smaller vehicles, the Capri often won structurally. The other car absorbed more damage, but the Capri's occupants still suffered devastating injuries because the energy involved was enormous and unmanaged. Winning the collision did not mean surviving it. Drivers who survived Capri crashes often described the experience as hitting a wall. There was no sense of sliding, crumpling, or gradual slowing. The impact felt instantaneous and overwhelming. Injuries occurred immediately. Recovery was slow, if it came at all. These were not anomalies. They were the predictable result of a design philosophy that prioritized structural dignity over human fragility. The Capri arrived at a turning point in automotive history. By 1960, engineers already understood alternative approaches. Controlled deformation existed. Collapsible steering columns were being developed. Energy-absorbing interiors were being studied. But these ideas had not yet been fully adopted or mandated. Luxury brands like Lincoln were especially resistant to change, fearing that visible deformation would undermine their image of permanence and prestige. As a result, the Capri became one of the last and most extreme expressions of the old belief system. It was luxury at its heaviest, strongest, and rigid, sold into a world where speeds were increasing, traffic was densifying, and crashes were becoming more severe. The mismatch was deadly. Today, the 1960 Lincoln Capri is admired for its elegance, restraint, and commanding presence. It looks stately and composed, a rolling symbol of American confidence. At car shows, it appears calm, dignified, and untouchable. What is rarely discussed is how little it did to protect the people inside when the moment of truth arrived. The Capri teaches one of the harshest lessons in automotive safety history. A car that does not absorb energy will force its occupants to do so instead. Mass without sacrifice is not protection. Rigidity without intelligence is not safety. Luxury without survivability is an illusion that shatters on impact. The 1960 Lincoln Capri failed because it was poorly engineered. It failed because it was engineered for the wrong idea of safety. In head-on crashes, its heavy luxury shell preserved metal at the expense of human life. And in that trade-off, survivability was bleak, not by accident, but by design.